We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Amar Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 50a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the Mishnah which said that a husband is not able to make a chazaka in the nichsei mulug, the property of his wife, because he's entitled to the peiros anyway. And since he's entitled to the peiros, the fact that he's working the field is no indication that he's an owner of the field. And the Gemara says it sounds like from the Mishnah if the husband would bring other kinds of evidence that he bought this field from the wife, so then he actually would be believed. And so the Gemara asked, why would he be believed? Why can't the wife just claim, Nachas ruach asisi labali, I just did it to please my husband, I wasn't serious about the sale, I just didn't want to anger him. And the Gemara says we see this concept of Nachas ruach asisi labali in a case where a buyer comes along and buys a field from the husband, but then he also wants to buy the rights to that field from the wife because she's going to collect that field in the event she might collect her ksuba. Let's say the husband dies before her, or let's say the husband divorces her, and it says over there that she can claim when she sells her rights to the field, when she sells that to the buyer, she can say, Nachas ruach asisi labali, it wasn't a serious sale, I just didn't want to anger my husband. So shouldn't it be the same thing when we're talking about nichsei mulug? And the Gemara answers that when it comes to Nachas ruach asisi labali, the statement was made that is specifically with regards to three kinds of fields that are designated specifically for her ksuba, not just the general property of the husband where we say there's a lien on all of his property. And the first kind of field is one that's specifically written into the ksuba that this field will be used for the ksuba. So the second one is one where it's not written into the shtar, but he designates one of the fields. He says essentially it's like an apoteki, which means that this is specifically designated for her ksuba. And also sometimes you have a field where she brings the property into the marriage, and then they evaluate what the property is worth, and they say that amount, the husband owes that amount to her, and they write that amount into the ksuba. It's like a dowry. So there's a specific field that's brought in, that's designated, that's referred to as nichsei tzon barzel. In any case, by those kinds of fields, she's allowed to say nachas ruach asisi labali. When she sells the rights that she has to those fields, she can say nachas ruach asisi labali. And so the Gemara now says, lemu'utei maina, when we're saying these three fields, what do we think we're excluding with that? Ilema lemu'utei shar nechasim, if you're going to say that it's to exclude the other property, because all of the husband's property is really meshubed for her ksuba. So if you're going to say it's that in those kinds of property she cannot say nachas ruach asisi labali, that doesn't make sense. Kol shekain dehavalev, on the contrary, there it's even more likely that it's going to cause hatred. The idea over here is by fields that are specifically designated for her ksuba, it makes sense that she'd be allowed to say, I don't want to sell it, because that really is something that more belongs to her. It's not something that's going to create hatred if she doesn't agree to sell it. And yet we're saying over there that still she could say nachas ruach asisi labali. So kol shekain, in a situation where it's just a random field of the husband's that's meshubet to her ksuba, for sure it's going to cause hatred if she's not willing to sell her rights. The Amar love, because he's going to say to her, you know why you don't want to sell it? A nechon asati begerish of amisa, that you're hoping that either there'll be a divorce or you're hoping for my death. You're hoping to get these fields. So certainly she can say nachas ruach asisi labali by the shar nechasim, by the other property. So what was that statement being made that it applies to these three specific fields? That was a statement made by Rabba bar Rav Huna. And so the Gemara says, Ella, rather it must be lemu'utei nichsei mulug. The whole point is to exclude nichsei mulug, meaning we're saying by nichsei mulug, there she does not have the claim of nachas ruach asisi labali. And the Rashbam explains, rather it must be that Rabba bar Rav Huna is coming to exclude nichsei mulug. There she doesn't have the claim of nachas ruach asisi labali. Also Rabba bar Rav Huna, that's what Rabba bar Rav Huna is saying. Devahanu Omar, that in those cases, meaning by nichsei mulug, we would say, im lokach minu ish, let's say for example, a buyer would come along and buy his rights to the nichsei mulug, the rights of the husband to the nichsei mulug, which are the produce, v'chazer v'lokach minu ish, and then he buys the wife's rights to the nichsei mulug from her. Mekchokayim, over there we would say that the sale does go through, and again we would not say that she can say nachas ruach asisi labali. And the Rashbam continues, the kevan de shalohin, because since these really are her properties, the nichsei mulug really belongs to her. Eina yagora mibala, she's not afraid of her husband. V'yachola limchos labala shelo yimchor, she can protest to her husband not to sell. V'lo motzes amar nachas ruach asisi labali, so therefore if she does sell, she can't later say that I was just doing it to please my husband. Umasnisa nami de katani, our Mishnah as well, which says ein lo ish chazaka b'nichsei ishto, again it said a husband can't make a chazak on his wife's property. Harayo yesh, but he could bring evidence that he bought it from her. B'nichsei mulug ma'iri, we're talking about again nichsei mulug. To kevan da nechasim shalos, since it's really her property. Lo matzis amar nachas ruach asisi labali. She can't say that I just did it to please my husband. We would say that the sale goes through. But the Gemara continues, is it really true that if she sells her rights to the Nichsei Mulug, that sale goes through, and she's not able to say, Nachas Ruach Hasisi Labali? Ha'amar Ameimar, but didn't Ameimar say, Ish v'isha shemachru b'Nichsei Mulug, that if the husband and wife sell the Nichsei Mulug, lo asu v'lo klum, they didn't do anything. And right now the Gemara thinks that it means that he, the husband, is selling his rights to the Nichsei Mulug, which is the rights to the produce, and she's selling her rights, because again, she gets the property. Let's say he dies first, or he divorces her. So together, they're selling the Nichsei Mulug, and it doesn't go through. The Gemara thinks it doesn't go through because of the fact that she can argue Nachas Ruach Hasisi Labali. Her part of the sale doesn't go through. And the Gemara says, no, that's not what Ameimar means at all. Ki itmar da Ameimar, what Ameimar said was in the following situation. Heicha de zav v'niyu v'mis, let's say he sold his parts of the Nichsei Mulug, the rights to the produce, and then he died. So then Asya iyu mafka, then she can come along and take back the Nichsei Mulug, just like she would get it from the husband if he died. So too if the husband sold it to a buyer, he sold his rights to the buyer, and then the husband dies, she'll be able to get that Nichsei Mulug. Inami the other way, or you could say the other way as well. Zav na'iva mesa, let's say she sells her rights to the Nichsei Mulug. Again, she collects all that property after her husband dies, if he dies first, or after the divorce, but let's say she's the one that then ends up dying first, so then asa iu mapik, so then the husband can come along and take it away from the buyer, because now, again, then the Nichsei Mulug goes back to the husband. B'takan to the Rabbanan, this all works according to the takana of the Rabbanan. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, it's like Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, the Yom Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, because Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, B'usha hiskinu, in Usha they made the following takana, Ha'isha shemachra b'nichsei mulug, let's say the wife sells her rights to the nichsei mulug, v'meisen, she dies, Habal motzi miyad halakuchas, the husband is able to take it away from the buyers. Aval heicha de zavinu tarvayu li'alma, but let's say, for example, they would both sell the nichsei mulug, meaning together, each one would sell their portion of the nichsei mulug, the husband would sell his rights to the buyer, and the wife would sell her rights to the same buyer on the same property, so essentially the property is fully going over to the buyer. Inami zovna ihi ledidei, or let's say she would sell her rights to him, to the husband, so then zvina, so then her sale would be good, and again, she would not be able to claim nachas ruach hasisi lebali. And the Gemara continues, if you want, I could say another answer, Ameimar do'amar Rebbe Lazar. It could be that Ameimar, he says like Rebbe Lazar, meaning when Ameimar says that if the husband and the wife sell the nichsei mulug, it's not a good sale, that actually is not in accordance with our Mishnah, because it follows a different Tana. It follows the Tana Rebbe Lazar. And the Rashbam explains, Ameimar is talking when they both sell together, la'adam echad, to one buyer, kamar. That is what he was saying. To lo asu v'lo klum, that it's not a good sale. And even if he first buys from the husband his rights, and then buys from the wife her rights, and certainly when she sells her rights to her husband, again, it's not going to be a sale. And nevertheless, don't ask a question from our Mishnah, because the inference from our Mishnah is that it would be a sale. Because Ameimar holds like Rebbe Lazar. He learns it out from Psukim. The davar shel shnei shutfin, it's just a general halach. Anytime you have something that belongs to partners, shahaguf lazev ha'peros lazev, where one person owns the actual property, the other one has the rights to the produce. Ein koach l'shneim limchor. Both of them do not have the right to sell. The lo zekori balav v'lo zekori balav. Neither this one is called the owner nor the other one is called the owner. That's a particular shita of Rebbe Lazar. Umasnisin the Rabbanan the pligio led the Rebbe Lazar. Our Mishnah happens to follow the Rabbanan that argue on Rebbe Lazar and say it is possible to sell in such a situation. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, hamocher es avdo, if somebody sells his slave, upasak imo sheyimashenu shloshim yom, and he makes a deal that for 30 days the seller says, I'm going to use the eved, even though I've sold you the eved, but I'm going to use the eved for the next 30 days. So now you have a situation in these 30 days where the seller, he owns the payros, he owns whatever the slave produces, but the buyer is the one that owns the actual slave. So there's a halach of yomo yomayim. The halach of yomo yomayim is that the owner of a slave, let's say the owner of a slave strikes his slave, and then the slave lingers for a day or two and then dies. Normally, a person would be chayiv capital punishment for killing another person in this way. But if a person kills his own slave in this fashion, that's a din of yomo yomayim. He's exempt from the capital punishment. And so the question over here is, who is the owner of this slave that has this din, this exemption of yomo yomayim? Is it the seller who right now just owns the payros of the eved, or is it the buyer who owns the eved himself? So that's a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Meir says harishon yeshno b'din yomo yomayim. The first owner, meaning the seller, he's the real owner, and he has the halach of yomo yomayim mipnei shu ta'achtav, because right now he's using the eved. The eved is producing for him. V'hasheni eino b'din yomo yomayim. But the second one, meaning the buyer, he does not have the exemption of Yom Yomayim Mipnei Sheino Tachtav, because the Eved is not working for him right now in these 30 days. Kasavar Kinyan Peiros Kinyan Haguf Dami. Rabbi Meir holds that owning the produce, owning the Peiros, is like owning the actual item, in this case the slave. Rabbi Yehuda says Hasheni Yeshno B'din Yom O Yomayim. It's the other way around. The second one, the buyer who owns the actual slave, has the din of Yom O Yomayim Mimnei Shu Kasbo, because this is his money. He owns the slave. Harishon Eno B'din Yom O Yomayim. The first one, the seller, is does not have this exemption, this halach of Yom O Yomayim. She'eno Kasbo, because it's not his money. He's just getting the produce. He's just getting whatever the slave produces. Kasavar, because Rabbi Yehuda holds Kinyan Peiros Lavka Kinyan Aguf Dami, that Kinyan Peiros is not considered Kinyan Aguf. Rabbi Yossi says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Amud Beis.